successful businessman in his mid-30s, sat behind the wheel, gripping it confidently, though a sense of unease was growing within him. Next to him, his business partner and longtime friend, David, remained silent, staring straight ahead at the road. They were on a routine business trip, discussing the details of their latest project, when the unexpected happened. As they rounded a sharp curve, a figure suddenly emerged from the darkness. Before Jack could react, the car struck an unsuspecting pedestrian. Jack's heart raced as the impact reverberated through the vehicle. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. In the rearview mirror, he glimpsed a woman lying motionless on the road, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Beside her, a small child, no older than 5, lay curled up on the asphalt, her eyes closed, unmoving. "Oh God," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "What have we done?" David's expression remained stoic, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the door handle. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly but urgently. "We can't be involved in this." Jack glanced between the figures on the road and his partner. "But we can't just leave them here," he protested, struggling with his conscience and the consequences of their actions. "Jack, listen to me," David replied firmly. "If we stay, we'll be implicated. The police will have questions and it will only lead to more trouble. We need to handle this quietly, for both our sakes." Jack's mind was racing, his moral compass spinning as he weighed the consequences of their actions. The thought of abandoning the victims filled him with dread, but David's words held a certain logic that was hard to ignore. With a shaky breath, Jack nodded, his eyes still fixed on the motionless figures in the rearview mirror. "What do we do?" David's lips curled into a grim smile. "Leave it to me," he said, already opening the car door and stepping out into the rain. Jack watched as David approached the victims, his movements quick and efficient. He bent down, checking the woman's pulse, then turned his attention to the child. Jack's heart sank as he saw David shake his head, a silent acknowledgement that the child was beyond help. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Jack stepped out of the car, the cold rain soaking through his clothes as he joined David. Together, they carefully lifted the woman's body and carried her into the dense forest, burying her in a shallow grave, their hands trembling with the weight of their actions. As they made their way back to the car, Jack couldn't shake the haunting image of the child's lifeless form, left abandoned on the side of the road. He knew this moment would forever haunt him, a burden he would have to carry for the rest of his life. The drive to the village became a blur, the rain-soaked landscape blending into a haze as Jack's mind grappled with the enormity of what had just happened. David remained silent, his expression unreadable, leaving Jack to wrestle with the guilt that threatened to consume him. As they approached the village, Jack's eyes were drawn to the weathered sign marking the entrance, its letters barely visible through the sheets of rain. The village seemed frozen in time, its quaint houses and winding streets in stark contrast to the tragedy that had just unfolded. "We'll stop here for the night," David said, breaking the silence. "It's the only place for miles, and we need some time to gather ourselves." Jack nodded, his throat dry, as they turned onto the main street and began searching for a place to stay. The village felt eerily quiet, with only a few scattered lights illuminating the storefronts. In that moment, the weight of their actions bore down on them, and the urgency to act quickly became clear. They had no time to waste. The rain was coming down harder, and the last thing they wanted was to draw attention to themselves. With panic setting in, they made the decision to leave the child by the road, hoping someone else would come along before it was too late. Jack and David drove into a small village where the old houses cast long shadows under the overcast sky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and there was an unsettling aura, as if a warning was whispered on the wind. As they approached the only inn in sight, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The place looked frozen in time. Its wooden beams and stone walls stood in stark contrast to the modern world they had left behind. Exchanging glances with David, Jack realized they were both disturbed by the eerie atmosphere of the village. Stepping inside, they were greeted by an elderly man behind the counter, narrowing his eyes with suspicion. "Welcome to the Willow Inn," he said in a rough, unwelcoming voice. "Not often do we see strangers around here." Jack cleared his throat, trying to remain calm. "We're just passing through and looking for a place to stay for the night. Do you have any rooms available?" The man studied them for a moment, his gaze lingering on their expensive suits and briefcases. "Yes, we have a few rooms left, but what brings you to our little village?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his tone. "Just business," David quickly interjected, flashing the man a charming smile. "We're on our way to a meeting in the next town." The innkeeper nodded, his expression unchanging. "Well, you're in luck, not many visitors these days," he said, handing them the keys and pointing toward the stairs. "Rooms are down the hall on the left." As Jack and David entered their room, a sense of unease deepened. The dimly lit hallway, the creaking floorboards, and the oppressive atmosphere pressed down on them. Jack let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "This place gives me the creeps, David. Did you see the way the innkeeper looked at us?" David shrugged, unpacking his suitcase on the bed. "He's probably just not used to outsiders. Small towns can be like that, you know," he said, glancing at the gloomy landscape outside the window. "But still, something feels off about this place, doesn't it?" Jack nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the accident and the guilt that had weighed on him since. "I can't stop thinking about it," he murmured. "That woman's face, the whole situation." David moved beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We did what we had to do. The past can't be changed, but we can move forward." Later, after much contemplation, they decided to take a walk around the village to clear their heads. Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the rustling of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. The villagers they encountered eyed them with suspicion, their gazes cold and their expressions unreadable. They headed to the local store, where an elderly man stood behind the counter. As they began to talk, a local woman entered the store, her piercing gaze fixed on Jack. "I haven't seen you around before. What brings you here at this hour?" she asked, studying them closely. I just couldn't sleep. We decided to take a walk," Jack began, his voice trembling. "You're anxious, aren't you?" she interrupted, narrowing her eyes. "This village has a way of getting under your skin, doesn't it?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He glanced at David, who stood nearby, his expression tense. "Yes," David said, not breaking his gaze from the woman. "We felt it too." "I think you'd better head back to the inn," she insisted. "The night has a way of awakening the shadows in this place." Nodding silently, Jack and David turned and hurried out of the store, feeling her gaze burning into their backs. As they made their way back to the inn, the shadows around them seemed to deepen, and the wind whispered something sinister. The rain continued to beat against the windows of the Willow Inn as Jack sat on the edge of the creaky bed, his head in his hands. The guilt from the accident gnawed at him relentlessly, refusing to fade. He could still hear the sickening thud of the car colliding with the pedestrians. The sound of their bodies crumpling to the ground echoed in his mind. And the image of the child's lifeless body, which they had left on the road, haunted him. Jack lifted his head to meet David's eyes. "I can't stop thinking about it," he whispered. "The accident. I keep seeing their faces, hearing their cries. It's tearing me apart." David leaned forward, trying to remain calm. "I know, Jack, but we had no choice. We did what we had to do. There's no going back now." Jack shook his head, his hands trembling. "I feel like we're being watched. What if someone finds out what we did?" David placed a reassuring hand on Jack's shoulder. "No one saw us. We buried the body, Jack. We're safe here. We just need to keep calm and stay low." The eerie atmosphere of the village made Jack uneasy. He glanced around the dimly lit room, feeling the shadows closing in. A sudden knock at the door startled both men. David stood up, tense, and opened the door. The innkeeper, an elderly man with a weathered face, stood there. "Pardon me," the innkeeper said gruffly. "I just wanted to check if everything was to your liking." Jack and David exchanged wary glances. "Everything's fine," David replied cautiously. The innkeeper nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Good. This village has a way of getting under your skin. Be careful." With that, he turned and shuffled away. Jack shivered as the door closed. "Did you hear that? What does he mean by getting under your skin?" David frowned, his thoughts racing. "Something's not right here, Jack. We need to be careful." Another knock on the door interrupted them. David opened it to reveal a young woman, her expression sharp with suspicion. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," she said. "I'm Emily, and I've lived in this village my whole life. I know everyone who comes and goes, and I've never seen you two before." David forced a smile. "We're just passing through on business." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Business, huh? This village has a way of uncovering secrets. Be careful, gentlemen." As she left, Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. "David, this place, something's wrong here. What if they know?" David's face grew serious. "We need to stay calm, Jack. Whatever's going on, we can't let it get to us." The rain pelted the windows harder, and as the shadows grew, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the village was hiding something, and that it was only a matter of time before their secret was uncovered. As the night deepened, Jack and David grew increasingly uneasy. Every minute spent at the inn felt heavier, as if an unseen force surrounding the village was pushing them to leave. "David, we need to get out of here," Jack said quietly. His eyes filled with worry as he glanced at the mirror in the room. David nodded, agreeing silently. "This place, I think we've stayed here too long." The growing tension inside was mirrored by the howling wind outside. Both men quickly gathered their things and headed to the car. As they climbed in, the relentless rain pounded against the windows. The roads had become unrecognizable, but Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, determined to find a way out of the village. A tense silence filled the car. Jack's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. "We keep going in circles, David. We should have been out of here by now, but we keep ending up in the same place," he said, his voice edged with anxiety. David tried to remain calm, though there was a trace of unease in his eyes. "Maybe the GPS is just malfunctioning, but we'll find the way out," he said. Yet, each familiar landmark they passed only heightened their fear. Jack scanned the surroundings nervously. "Something's not right here. It's like this place won't let us leave." David placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll get out. We just need to find the right road." As they continued driving, the atmosphere grew heavier. Shadows seemed to take form, and strange figures started to appear in the mist. Suddenly, a dark figure emerged in the middle of the road. Jack swerved sharply, narrowly avoiding a crash. The car skidded, but he managed to regain control, stopping just beside the shadowy figure. The figure slowly approached, as if drawn by some mysterious force. Jack and David stared in stunned silence, barely able to breathe. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the figure's presence pulling him into a flood of memories from their past. "What the hell is this?" Jack whispered. his voice trembling. David's expression darkened slightly, but he tried to maintain his composure. "There's a lot about this village we don't understand," he replied. Jack's hand shook as he tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't start. The silence of the night now felt like the biggest threat. They were on the verge of revealing their darkest secret, but some hidden force seemed to be pulling them deeper into the unknown. The night was thick and unsettling. Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, but every time he turned, the roads kept leading him back to the village. The surroundings grew darker, and their fear intensified. David sat next to him, his voice sharp. "We need to get out of here, Jack. They'll find us." But something about David's voice didn't feel right to Jack. He was no longer sure if David was even real. "Something's wrong here," Jack muttered. "Why do we keep coming back? This can't just be a coincidence." David persisted. "Jack, stop asking foolish questions. We need to leave, and fast." They drove down the same streets again, and Jack felt something inside him break. He clenched his teeth and stopped the car, the engine stalling. David turned to him sharply. "Why did you stop? Keep driving." At that moment, Jack realized that all the decisions he'd made, hiding the truth, running away, burying the body, it was David who had advised him to do those things. But no one else had ever spoken to David. In the hotel, in the village, everyone only looked at Jack as if David didn't exist at all. "You're not real, are you?" Jack said quietly, not lifting his eyes to his companion. David fell silent, his face growing tense. He laughed softly, but the laugh was cold. "What are you trying to say, Jack? You were everywhere. Every time I had to make a choice, you always told me to do the worst thing." Jack finally dared to look David in the eyes. "But no one else ever saw you. Only me." The silence became oppressive, and David slowly began to fade away, like a shadow dissolving into the air. "I've been a part of you from the very beginning, Jack. I've always been with you. You knew this." Jack was left alone in the car, surrounded by the darkness of the village. Suddenly, he realized that all this time, he had been alone. David was just a part of his imagination, created by his own mind to justify his actions. All the mistakes, all the terrible decisions, it had been Jack himself. He looked out the window and saw only empty streets. Everything he had experienced was an illusion, his own fear and guilt. After a few moments of silence, Jack, his hands trembling, opened the car door and stepped outside. The cold wind hit his face, as if the dark secrets of the village were closing in on him. Empty streets, empty houses, there was no sign of life. Strangely, everything was silent, as if the village itself knew his truth and was now watching him. In his mind, David's voice still echoed. "We did this together. Everything together." But now Jack realized that David had never existed. Every step, every dark decision, it had all come from him. He had been running from reality for years, but now he had reached the end of this lie. Suddenly, in the distance, red and blue lights started to flash. Police cars. They were coming closer. Jack didn't move from where he stood, as if he was waiting for his final judgment. As the police cars approached, Jack felt even more empty. The guilt he had hidden for all these years was now standing right in front of him. The police cars stopped, and two officers approached. Their footsteps broke the silence as they came nearer, while Jack lowered his head, having no strength left to fight. A few seconds later, they handcuffed him and led him toward the car. Everything felt hazy, but he knew that the escape was over. As he was placed in the police car, Jack lowered his head and began to think once more in the darkness. In the room, when he was left alone, the silence returned. But this time the silence was broken, a faint laugh. It came from the corner of the room. When Jack raised his head, there, on the seat beside him, was David. David looked at him as if he had never left, with a familiar smile on his face. "We're still here, Jack," David whispered. Jack didn't feel alone. He had never been alone.